A black teenager boards a plane, his heart racing with excitement for the journey ahead. But as he steps into business class, a flight attendant takes one look at him and decides he doesn't belong. Her assumptions lead to curt comments, dismissive glances, and ultimately, the shocking decision to kick him off the plane. What she didn't know, however, was that his father, a quiet but powerful billionaire, was watching everything unfold. What happened next stunned the entire cabin and sparked a wave of conversations no one could ignore. This story isn't just about the moment, it's about what it revealed. Stay with me, because you won't believe how this ended. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments, and if this story hits home for you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make a difference. Let's uncover how a single act of prejudice unraveled in ways no one could have predicted. The airport hummed with its usual cacophony, announcements echoing overhead, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, and the low murmur of travelers exchanging last-minute instructions or farewells. Hassan stood quietly near gate 22, his sleek black backpack slung over one shoulder, a crumpled boarding pass clutched in his hand. His pressed white shirt and dark jeans reflected a young man raised to value order. But his darting eyes betrayed a hint of unease. He scanned the room, a sea of faces, none that seemed to acknowledge him. And yet, he could feel the weight of being observed. When the gate attendant called for business class boarding, Hassan straightened his posture. He had practiced this moment in his mind. Walk confidently. Hand over the ticket. Say, thank you, and move on. Simple. Routine. But as he stepped forward, a voice sharp and deliberate cut through the murmur. Excuse me, young man, the flight attendant said, her smile poised but her tone unmistakably rigid. She was tall, with immaculate blonde hair pulled back into a bun, and a name tag that read Alicia Carter. Her blue scarf was tied in a perfect knot, but the way she adjusted it while glancing at Hassan spoke louder than words. Yes, ma'am, Hassan replied, his voice steady but soft. He handed her the ticket, maintaining eye contact. Alicia scanned the boarding pass, her brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. Business class? She asked, tilting her head ever so slightly. Her voice carried the faintest edge of disbelief, masked as casual curiosity. Yes, ma'am, Hassan confirmed, nodding. He pointed at the printed seat assignment. Her pause stretched a fraction longer than necessary. She forced a smile, but her lips barely curved. Must be a mistake, she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for Hassan to hear. Hassan's grip tightened on the strap of his backpack. No mistake, he said quietly, his tone polite but firm. Alicia hesitated, her fingers lingering on the ticket before she finally stepped aside. Fine, she said, her voice clipped, but make sure you stay in your assigned seat. Business class only. Hassan nodded and walked past her, feeling the heat of her eyes boring into his back. Each step down the jet bridge felt heavier than the last, his shoulders stiffening under the weight of what had just transpired. Around him, other passengers shuffled past, oblivious or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the tension. The cabin welcomed Hassan with an air of muted luxury, plush leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. He found his seat by the window and settled in, carefully placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. His hands trembled as he pulled out a book, but he steadied them, refusing to let the encounter at the gate shake him. The hum of boarding continued, passengers filing in with a mix of urgency and nonchalance. Alicia appeared moments later, walking briskly through the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. When her eyes landed on Hassan, they lingered for a heartbeat too long, her lips pursing as if suppressing a comment. She quickly turned her attention to a man in a tailored suit struggling to fit his carry-on into the overhead bin. Her tone shifted, suddenly warm, accommodating, almost flirtatious. Hassan caught the exchange from the corner of his eye and sighed. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed this kind of performance, the subtle but pointed difference in how people treated him compared to others. It was the kind of slight his father had warned him about, unspoken but unmistakable, embedded in the very fabric of daily life. The plane filled quickly, the cabin buzzing with the quiet energy of pre-flight preparations. Alicia made her rounds, her movements crisp and efficient, her demeanor brightening with each interaction that didn't involve Hassan. When she reached his row, she stopped abruptly. Sir, she said curtly, gesturing toward the water bottle on his tray table. You'll need to stow that for takeoff. Hassan nodded and reached for the bottle. But before he could place it in the seat pocket, Alicia snatched it from the table. I'll do it, she muttered, stuffing it into the pocket with unnecessary force. The gesture, though small, felt monumental. Hassan clenched his jaw and inhaled deeply, willing himself to remain calm. He opened his book again, though the words blurred on the page. Nearby, a middle-aged woman in a pearl necklace watched the interaction with a subtle frown. She caught Hassan's eye and offered a small, sympathetic smile. He returned it with a slight nod, appreciating the silent acknowledgement, but it did little to ease the knot tightening in his chest. As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied to the runway, Hassan closed his eyes, letting the hum of the aircraft drown out his thoughts. He had learned long ago not to dwell on moments like these, to rise above them as his father had taught him. But today, the sting felt sharper, the weight heavier. Alicia, now stationed at the front of the cabin, glanced back at Hassan. Her gaze was fleeting, but it carried a familiar judgment, a quiet dismissal of his presence in a space she didn't believe he belonged. The plane lifted off, the world below shrinking into a patchwork of roads and rooftops. Hassan stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him. Somewhere in the distance, his father's voice echoed in his mind. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone. Son, you already know who you are. But as the tension simmered in the cabin, Hassan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the faint chime of the seatbelt sign extinguishing blending with the low hum of the engines. Hassan leaned back in his seat, trying to will his tension into the soft cushion behind him. He turned the page of his book but found that the words refused to settle in his mind. Instead, his thoughts looped back to the brief but pointed interactions with Alicia, each one carving deeper into his patience. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls, her name, as Hassan would later learn, was Mrs. Hargrove, stole another glance at him. Her gaze was neither intrusive nor pitying, but curious, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle. Hassan gave her a polite smile, one that said, "I'm fine," though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Alicia reappeared in the cabin, her polished shoes clicking on the aisle floor, her clipboard in hand. Her expression had returned to the neutral mask of professionalism, but her eyes gave her away sharp. Darting, assessing, she walked past Hassan without a word, though her gaze lingered on him just long enough to register as deliberate. Hassan felt the weight of that look, and he wasn't alone. A businessman seated 2 rows ahead glanced back briefly, his brow furrowing. A whisper passed between him and his seatmate, though Hassan couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. The cabin was becoming a stage, the players quietly taking their positions, the tension building as unseen but tangible as a gathering storm. When Alicia returned with the drink cart, her tone shifted depending on the passenger she addressed. For the woman in pearls, there was warmth. Would you care for sparkling water or wine? Ma'am? For the suited man in the aisle seat, sir. Can I offer you something to drink? But when she reached Hassan, her voice cooled noticeably, the mask slipping ever so slightly. Water, she said, placing the cup on his tray table before he could respond. There was no question, no acknowledgement, just the cold efficiency of someone fulfilling a duty without care. Thank you, Hassan said, his voice measured. He picked up the cup and took a sip, his hands steady despite the churn in his stomach. From across the aisle, Mrs. Hargrove's frown deepened. She leaned closer to Hassan as Alicia moved on, her voice soft but firm. Young man, don't you let her or anyone else make you feel small, she said. Her southern drawl softened the edges of her words, but her intent was razor sharp. Hassan nodded, grateful but wary. I'm used to it, he replied quietly, a rueful smile ghosting across his lips. Mrs. Hargrove leaned back in her seat, but her gaze remained fixed on Alicia, now laughing lightly with a passenger in the front row. The cabin settled into a lull as passengers unwrapped meals, adjusted headphones, or flipped through magazines. Hassan reopened his book, determined to lose himself in its pages. But the momentary peace didn't last. Alicia returned, her expression tighter now, her movements brisk. As she passed Hassan's row, her eyes landed on the water bottle sticking slightly out of the seat pocket. She stopped abruptly. That's a safety hazard, she said, her tone louder than necessary. Several heads turned, including Mrs. Hargrove's, who set down her book with a deliberate calm. "I'll fix it," Hassan said, reaching for the bottle. But Alicia was faster, yanking it out with a sharp motion. "I'll take care of it," she snapped, shoving the bottle into the cart. Her voice carried an edge, one that seemed designed to underline her authority. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. The businessman from earlier leaned slightly toward his seatmate, whispering again. Mrs. Hargrove, her patience clearly fraying, crossed her arms and gave Alicia a pointed look. Mrs. Hargrove called out, her voice carrying across the cabin like a bell. Alicia paused, her shoulders stiffening. "I believe that young man was perfectly capable of handling his own water bottle." Alicia turned, her professional smile strained. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her tone tight. "I was just ensuring safety regulations were followed." Mrs. Hargrove replied, her tone noncommittal but laced with an unspoken challenge. She turned back to Hassan and gave him an approving nod, as though to say, "I've got your back." Hassan offered her a small, grateful smile but kept his focus on his book. He could feel the cabin's energy shifting, the air growing heavier with each interaction. The flight pressed on, but the tension didn't dissipate. Instead, it simmered, each glance, each whispered word feeding into an undercurrent that ran through the cabin. Alicia, now visibly rattled, fumbled slightly as she moved through her tasks. Her polished veneer began to crack, her clipped movements betraying a growing unease. Hassan, for his part, remained outwardly calm, though the storm inside him churned. He thought of his father, Idris, who had taught him to navigate moments like these with grace. "They'll see you as less, son," his father had once said. "But you don't have to prove them wrong. You just have to keep walking." But as the minutes ticked by, Hassan wondered how much longer he could keep walking before the weight became too much to bear. When Alicia returned to the galley, her colleague, a younger attendant with kind eyes, approached her. "Everything okay in business class?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Fine," Alicia replied curtly, though her voice betrayed her irritation. "Just a challenging passenger." Her colleague raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Alicia turned away, busying herself with organizing the meal trays. But her mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the whispers just out of earshot but loud enough to unsettle her. And then, as she glanced toward the cabin, her gaze landed on Hassan again. He sat quietly, his posture straight, his hands folded over his book. But there was something in his stillness and unshakable dignity that made her chest tighten. Unbeknownst to her, Hassan had noticed her too. And though he remained silent, he could feel the fault lines in the cabin deepening, the unspoken divide between them widening with every passing moment. The stage was set, the tension was palpable, and neither Hassan nor Alicia could yet see how close they were to the inevitable breaking point. The cabin was quiet, save for the steady hum of the engines and the occasional clink of a glass. Passengers had settled into their routines, watching movies or scrolling on their devices. But beneath the surface, the air was heavy with a tension that only a few dared to acknowledge. Hassan sat motionless, his hands resting on the open book in his lap. The words on the page blurred as his mind replayed the sharpness of Alicia's tone, the dismissal in her eyes. He had faced moments like this before, a cold shoulder here, a subtle slight there, but today, the weight of it felt different, heavier. He closed the book gently, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Across the aisle, Mrs. Hargrove observed him with quiet intensity. She leaned toward her seatmate, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, and whispered something. He glanced at Hassan, his expression softening, then nodded. Their exchange, though discreet, didn't go unnoticed by Hassan, who gave them a faint, polite smile before turning back to the window. Alicia re-entered the cabin, pushing the dessert cart with stiff, mechanical movements. Her usual poise was gone, replaced by an almost frantic energy. She stopped at the first row, her voice unnaturally bright as she offered a selection of sweets to the passengers. But as she worked her way closer to Hassan, her demeanor shifted once more. When she reached his row, she didn't speak. Instead, she placed a dessert on his tray table without asking for his preference, her hand moving so quickly it nearly knocked over his water. "Thank you," Hassan said softly, his tone steady but cool. Alicia hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line, then moved on without acknowledging him. From the row behind him, a man in a tailored blazer leaned forward. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice low but clear. Hassan turned slightly, meeting the man's gaze. There was no pity in his expression, only a quiet solidarity. Hassan nodded in acknowledgement, but inside, his composure was beginning to fray. He wanted to dismiss the incident, to bury it under the countless other moments of subtle prejudice he had endured. But the murmurs around him, the stolen glances, and Alicia's pointed avoidance refused to let him. At the front of the cabin, Alicia leaned against the galley counter, her breath shallow. Her colleague approached her again, concern etched on her face. "You sure you're okay? You seem off," the younger woman said, her voice careful. Alicia waved her off, shaking her head. "I'm fine, just tired." But even as she said the words, her mind raced. She could feel the passengers watching her, could sense their judgment in the faint hum of whispers behind her. She knew she had made a mistake several. In fact, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it, not even to herself. Her colleague hesitated, then nodded and returned to her duties. Alicia took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand straighter, to regain the control she felt slipping away. She smoothed her uniform and stepped back into the aisle, determined to carry on as though nothing had happened. As Alicia made her rounds, the atmosphere in the cabin grew taut. Passengers exchanged knowing looks, their whispers becoming louder. Mrs. Hargrove, who had remained silent for most of the flight, finally broke her composure. "Excuse me, miss," she called out, her voice cutting through the low murmur. Alicia stopped mid-step, her face flushing. "Yes, ma'am," she said, forcing a tight smile. Mrs. Hargrove gestured toward Hassan. "I couldn't help but notice that you've been rather selective in your attentions. Is there a reason this young man hasn't been treated with the same courtesy as the rest of us?" The cabin fell silent. All eyes turned to Alicia, who stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her tray. She began, her voice faltering. "I assure you, ma'am, I treat all passengers equally." Mrs. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, her expression both sharp and disbelieving. "Do you? Because it seems to me that your idea of equal is rather skewed." A few passengers nodded in agreement, their murmurs of support growing louder. Alicia's face reddened, her carefully constructed professionalism crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. In his seat, Hassan felt a pang of guilt mingling with his frustration. He hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't wanted to become the center of a brewing confrontation. But as he looked at Mrs. Hargrove, her eyes blazing with indignation, he realized she was voicing what he couldn't or wouldn't say. Alicia straightened, her expression hardening. "I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone clipped. "But I assure you, I'm simply doing my job." Mrs. Hargrove tilted her head, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "Then perhaps it's time you did it better," she said, her words cutting through the cabin like a blade. The silence that followed was deafening. Alicia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply and retreated to the galley, her footsteps echoing like gunshots down the aisle. The tension in the cabin didn't dissipate after Alicia's departure, if anything. It grew heavier. Hassan felt the weight of every glance, every whispered word. He wanted to sink into his seat, to disappear entirely, but he knew that wasn't an option. Mrs. Hargrove leaned toward him once more. "You've handled this with far more grace than she deserves," she said softly, her voice warm but firm. "Thank you," Hassan replied, his voice low, "but I'm just trying to get through the flight." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her expression softening. "I understand, dear, but sometimes, silence isn't the answer." Hassan considered her words, the weight of them settling in his chest. He had always been taught to rise above, to take the high road. But in moments like this, the high road felt unbearably lonely. As the plane continued its journey, the storm brewing in the cabin threatened to break. And for Hassan, the question lingered. How much longer could he endure before the cracks in his own facade gave way? The cabin had settled into a fragile silence, the kind that felt more like the sharp intake of breath before an explosion. Hassan remained in his seat, his hands clasped tightly over his book as though anchoring himself. Around him, passengers exchanged glances, their unspoken thoughts thickening the air. The tension was no longer subtle, it was tangible, a living thing that pulsed between every row. Alicia had not returned from the galley since Mrs. Hargrove's pointed remark. It was a retreat Hassan had seen before when people, confronted with their own actions, chose avoidance over reflection. He wanted to move on, to leave this moment behind him. But the cabin's collective unease refused to let the incident dissolve into memory. The silence was interrupted by a sudden shift. A passenger in first class, a man of imposing stature and impeccable dress, stepped through the curtain separating the cabins. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. The low murmurs among the passengers stilled as eyes turned toward him. Recognition flashing across several faces. It was Idris Walker, Hassan's father. Hassan sat up straighter as his father approached. The familiar weight of his presence both a comfort and a source of apprehension. Idris moved with purpose, his gaze sweeping over the cabin before landing on Hassan. His expression softened immediately, the lines of his face relaxing into a warm smile. "Son," he said, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the cabin. "How's the flight treating you?" Hassan hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal. "It's fine, Dad," he said, his tone carefully measured, but Idris's discerning eyes narrowed slightly, as though reading the truth beneath his son's words. Behind them, Alicia reappeared, her face pale and her steps hesitant. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Idris, her professional mask slipping further as recognition dawned. The man she had seen on magazine covers, speaking on stages, and shaking hands with world leaders was standing just a few feet away. And worse, her mind raced to piece together the connection. He was speaking to the very passenger she had dismissed. "Is this your seat, Mr. Walker?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling slightly. The effort to regain her composure was evident, but the strain showed in her clenched hands. Idris turned toward her, his expression calm but unreadable. "No," he said simply. "I came to check on my son." The weight of his words landed like a blow. The murmurs that had subsided moments ago rose again, passengers whispering among themselves, their curiosity and judgment swirling in the confined space. Alicia's eyes darted to Hassan, the pieces clicking into place. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, but Idris raised a hand, a small, deliberate motion that silenced her before she could begin. The tension broke as Mrs. Hargrove spoke, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Well," she said, her southern drawl heavy with disdain, "it seems the young man everyone was so eager to judge isn't so out of place after all." Her words were pointed, a direct challenge to anyone who had shared in Alicia's silent assumptions. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to their laps. Hassan felt his face flush. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be the center of a confrontation that felt both deeply personal and painfully public. He looked up at his father, silently pleading for an end to the moment. Idris nodded subtly, understanding. He turned back to Alicia, his voice measured but firm. "Miss, my son deserves the same respect as any other passenger on this flight. I trust that won't be an issue moving forward." Alicia swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. "Of course, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I sincerely apologize if." "Not if," Idris interrupted, his tone sharpening ever so slightly. "You know what happened. The question is whether you've learned from it." Alicia's face reddened, but she nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I have." Idris turned back to Hassan, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You good, champ?" he asked, his voice softer now. Hassan nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm good." Idris lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping the cabin one last time. The passengers, now silent, avoided his eyes. Satisfied, he gave his son a final pat on the shoulder and returned to the first-class cabin. The cabin remained quiet long after Idris had gone, the weight of his presence lingering like a shadow. Alicia moved stiffly through her tasks, her usual confidence replaced by an almost robotic efficiency. Mrs. Hargrove shot her a final look of disapproval before returning to her book. Her point made. Hassan, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, his mind churning. The moment was over, but the echoes of it would remain with him. He thought of his father's words, direct, unyielding, but fair, and felt a flicker of pride. But beneath it was a deeper weariness, the kind that came from carrying the weight of expectations, assumptions, and silent battles day after day. As the plane continued its journey, The storm that had broken in the cabin left its mark on everyone. For Hassan, it was a reminder of the quiet resilience he would always need to carry. For Alicia, it was a reckoning she could no longer ignore. And for the passengers who had watched it all unfold, it was a lesson etched into the fabric of an otherwise ordinary flight. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. But the atmosphere in the business class cabin remained anything but calm. Conversations had dwindled to whispers, the air thick with the unspoken tension left in Idris Walker's wake. Hassan, sitting with his hands resting lightly on the closed cover of his book, felt the weight of every gaze that darted toward him and then quickly away. He wasn't unfamiliar with moments like these, moments where he became the unwitting focus of everyone around him. But this time, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about a dismissive glance or a muttered comment. It was about the collision of perception and reality. About how easily a person could be reduced to assumptions. Alicia remained at the front of the cabin, mechanically arranging service items in the galley. Her movements were sharp, precise, and yet betraying the storm churning inside her. Every now and then, she glanced toward the passengers, her eyes flickering briefly to Hassan before darting away. The weight of her earlier actions hung over her like a fog. Her colleague, a younger attendant with a soft voice and kinder eyes, approached hesitantly. "Alicia," she began, her tone low and cautious. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Alicia snapped, her voice tight, but the crack in her composure was obvious. She sighed and softened her tone, running a hand over her perfectly tied scarf. I made a mistake." The younger attendant nodded but didn't speak. She knew better than to push. Instead, she gave Alicia a brief pat on the shoulder before stepping away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Hassan, meanwhile, felt a tug of conflicting emotions. Relief that his father had intervened was tempered by a nagging discomfort. He admired Idris's calm authority, the way he could command a room with just a few words. But Hassan couldn't shake the feeling that his father's presence had only amplified the divide in the cabin. Where there had been whispers before, there was now a chorus of judgment, an unrelenting spotlight on him that he hadn't asked for. Across the aisle, Mrs. Hargrove leaned forward, her expression softening. "Young man," she said gently, her southern drawl deliberate and warm, "you handled yourself beautifully back there." Hassan smiled faintly, appreciating her support but feeling its weight nonetheless. "Thank you," he replied, "but I didn't really do anything." "Oh, but you did," she insisted. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is hold your ground without saying a word." Her comment lingered with Hassan. He nodded, grateful for her kindness, but his mind churned with questions. What does it mean to hold your ground in a world that seems determined to test it? And how do you hold your ground when the ground itself feels shaky? The quiet didn't last long. Alicia re-entered the cabin, her polished smile back in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved down the aisle with a tray of drinks, her demeanor carefully neutral, but when she reached Hassan's row, her hand faltered. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been all flight. It wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't the cold indifference he'd come to expect from her either. "No, thank you," Hassan replied politely, his tone neutral. He could see the faint flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the slightest quiver in her hand as she adjusted the tray. For a brief moment, he wondered if she truly understood the depth of the moment or if her discomfort was purely performative. As she moved on, Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the air once more. "Miss," she called out, her tone sharp enough to turn heads. "If you're going to offer drinks, you might as well do it with some sincerity." Several passengers chuckled softly, their laughter carrying a faint note of vindication. Alicia froze, her shoulders stiffening, before she turned toward Mrs. Hargrove with a tight-lipped smile. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her voice strained, but the damage was already done. The energy in the cabin began to shift. Passengers, emboldened by Idris's earlier intervention and Mrs. Hargrove's pointed remarks, started to exchange louder whispers. Some voiced quiet agreement, while others glanced at Alicia with barely concealed disapproval. The once hidden tension was now a tangible force, crackling in the air like static electricity. For Hassan, it was both a relief and a burden. On one hand, he felt seen, his experience acknowledged in a way that was rare and powerful. But on the other, he felt exposed, as though his every move was being scrutinized through a lens he hadn't asked for. He shifted in his seat, glancing out the window at the endless expanse of sky. The view, usually a source of calm, offered little comfort now. His mind buzzed with his father's voice. It's not about what they think of you, son. It's about how you choose to carry yourself despite it. As the plane continued its journey, the cabin grew quieter once more. Though the tension remained, Alicia retreated to the galley, her polished facade finally crumbling. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping its edge as though it might steady her. She thought about Hassan, about the way he had sat there calm, composed, dignified despite everything. She thought about his father, about the quiet power in his voice and the weight of his words. And she thought about herself, about the assumptions she had made, the judgments she had cast without even realizing it. Alicia closed her eyes, the memory of Idris's words replaying in her mind. The question is whether you've learned from it. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. It wasn't just about a water bottle or a tone of voice. It was about how she had diminished someone with nothing more than her own prejudice, a prejudice so deeply ingrained she hadn't even recognized it until it was too late. The realization hit her like a wave, overwhelming and humbling, and as she stood there, gripping the counter and staring at the polished surface of the galley, she knew that this flight was more than just a routine journey. It was a reckoning, one she couldn't ignore. In the cabin, Hassan remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The world outside seemed infinite, unchanging, and indifferent, but inside, the air was charged with the possibility of something greater, a confrontation not just of individuals but of the unspoken forces that shaped their interactions. The journey wasn't over, but the storm that had been brewing since takeoff had finally broken. And as the plane continued its path through the sky, Hassan, Alicia, and everyone around them were left to navigate the wreckage and perhaps to rebuild something stronger. The hum of the engines was the only sound that tethered the cabin to calm, though the air inside it was taut with unspoken words and unfinished reckonings. Hassan, seated at the edge of this invisible storm, tried to steady himself against the weight of it. The moment had passed his father's commanding presence, Mrs. Hargrove's pointed remarks, but the aftermath lingered. It always lingered. His gaze drifted to the window, where the clouds below looked serene, untouched by the turbulence of human discord. Hassan envied their detachment. Inside this plane, detachment felt impossible. He was not just Hassan, the teenager reading a book in seat 4A, he was Hassan, the son of Idris Walker, the boy who had unwittingly become a lightning rod for the unspoken truths of everyone around him. The cabin's fragile equilibrium cracked as a voice rose from behind him. It was a man's voice, low but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Excuse me," the man said, addressing no one and everyone all at once. He leaned into the aisle, his face creased with irritation. His words were directed at Alicia, who had just returned to the cabin with a forced smile plastered on her face. "I'd like to understand why you treated that young man differently than the rest of us." The question landed like a bomb. Passengers turned their heads, their gazes swinging between the man, Alicia, and Hassan. Alicia froze mid-step, her eyes widening in surprise and, for the first time, something that looked like fear. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her hands, which had been gripping a tray of coffee cups, trembled slightly. "I beg your pardon?" she managed finally, her voice barely audible. "You heard me," the man said, his tone unrelenting. "We all saw it. The way you looked at him. The way you spoke to him. And now we're all wondering why." Hassan's stomach tightened. He wanted to sink into his seat, to disappear into the fabric of the chair. This wasn't what he wanted, this spotlight, this confrontation. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You don't have to fight every battle, son. Sometimes the world will fight it for you." But sitting here now, he wasn't sure if that made him feel empowered or powerless. Alicia, caught between the man's accusations and the silent judgment of the cabin, stammered, "There was no intention to treat anyone unfairly. I was just doing my job." Her words rang hollow, and the passengers knew it. Mrs. Hargrove let out a soft, audible sigh of disbelief. The suited man a few rows ahead shook his head, his lips pressing into a tight line. The first man, undeterred, leaned forward. "Doing your job?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Tell me, Is it part of your job to dismiss someone based on how they look? Because that's exactly what you did. The energy in the cabin shifted from tension to something more volatile. Like a match struck in a room filled with gas. Passengers began whispering openly now, their voices blending into a low murmur that filled the space. Hassan felt the burn of their attention, and his instinct was to diffuse the situation. He turned slightly in his seat, his voice calm but firm. "It's okay," he said, addressing the man. "You don't have to do this." But the man shook his head. "No, son," he said, his voice softening. "It's not okay, and staying quiet about it doesn't make it okay." Alicia, visibly flustered, took a step back. She clutched the tray to her chest as though it might shield her from the growing tide of discontent. I apologize if I gave that impression," she said, her voice trembling. "That wasn't my intention." Hassan could see the cracks in her facade now, guilt mingling with defensiveness. Shame colliding with pride. He didn't know whether to feel vindicated or exhausted by it. The apology wasn't for him. Not really. It was for the crowd. For the eyes that now bore into her with the same weight that had been on him since he'd boarded the plane. From the front of the cabin, a new voice broke through the chaos. Idris Walker had returned. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady and commanding. He walked toward Hassan's row, his presence silencing the whispers instantly. The passengers turned their attention to him, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. Idris stopped next to Alicia, his towering frame a stark contrast to her diminutive, trembling figure. He didn't look angry, but there was a gravity in his expression that made everyone around him hold their breath. "Apologies are important," he said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "But they mean nothing without accountability." Alicia's eyes filled with tears she fought to suppress. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. "I hope you do," Idris replied, his tone softening just slightly. "Because this moment isn't just about my son. It's about how you choose to see people, and how you let that choice guide your actions." The cabin was silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the engines. Idris turned to Hassan, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low but warm. Hassan nodded. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." Idris gave his son a small smile, then turned to address the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Thank you for your concern. But I think we've all learned what we needed to from this moment." The passengers nodded, some murmuring their agreement. Mrs. Hargrove gave Idris an approving smile, while the man who had spoken up first leaned back in his seat, satisfied. As Idris returned to the first-class cabin, the energy in business class began to shift. The whispers faded, replaced by quiet, introspective stillness. Alicia retreated to the galley, her movements shaky but purposeful. Hassan leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. For the first time since the flight began, he felt a sense of relief, not because the confrontation was over, but because he had witnessed something rare, the possibility of change. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm, but the lessons of the moment lingered in the air. And for Hassan, the journey ahead felt lighter, if only slightly. The cabin hummed with an uneasy stillness, as though the air itself carried the weight of what had transpired. Passengers returned to their screens and books, but their focus was fractured. The confrontation had left an imprint, words unspoken, thoughts lingering just beneath the surface. Hassan sat in his seat, his gaze fixed out the window. Below, the clouds formed an endless, shifting blanket, indifferent to the tensions in the metal tubes slicing through them. He traced his finger along the spine of his book, finding solace in its worn edges. Yet, his mind churned with the echoes of voices, the quiet battle that had unfolded around him. He thought of his father's calm resolve, the way he had stepped into the fray with the same unyielding dignity that he had always carried. It was something Hassan had admired for as long as he could remember. But admiration didn't soften the sharp edges of reality. What stayed with him, like a thorn lodged deep, was the simple fact that the burden of correction had once again fallen on them, not just his father, but him too. In the galley, Alicia stood motionless, her hands gripping the counter as though it might steady her. Her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee machine stared back at her. And she didn't like what she saw. She had spent her career perfecting the art of composure, the illusion of effortless service. But today, that illusion had cracked, and the raw, Unvarnished truth beneath it had been exposed. Alicia wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the accusations hurled at her or the growing realization that they were justified. Her colleague, the younger attendant with kind eyes, approached cautiously. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. Her voice soft, almost hesitant. Alicia shook her head. "I just need a moment," she whispered, her voice tight, but her colleague didn't leave. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on Alicia's arm. "Moments like these aren't just about what happened," the younger woman said. "They're about what you do next." Alicia turned toward her, her eyes searching for something guidance. Absolution. She wasn't sure. "What if I've already done too much damage?" she asked, her voice cracking. Her colleague smiled faintly, a touch of warmth breaking through the tension. "Then you fix it. Or at least, you try." Back in the cabin, Hassan's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet voice of Mrs. Hargrove. "Young man," she said, leaning slightly toward him, "I hope you know how much strength it takes to sit through all this with your head held high." Hassan glanced at her, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thank you," he said simply, "but sometimes, it feels like holding your head high just makes you a bigger target." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "I can't imagine what it's like," she admitted, "but I do know this. People like you. People who endure with grace. They change the world more than the ones who shout the loudest." Her words settled over Hassan like a blanket, not quite comforting, but grounding. He appreciated her kindness, but he knew better than to let it soothe the ache entirely. Kind words didn't erase the sting of experience. The calm was interrupted again, this time by an unexpected voice, Alicia's. She stood at the edge of the aisle, her posture hesitant, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For a moment, it seemed as though she might turn and retreat to the galley. But then she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hassan," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach him without breaking the cabin's fragile quiet. Hassan turned, his expression guarded but curious. Alicia's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously to the other passengers before settling on him. "I need to say something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology. Not just for how I treated you, but for the assumptions I made without even realizing it." The cabin stilled, passengers now openly watching. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their intent. Hassan stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had heard apologies before, some sincere, some performative, and he wasn't sure yet where hers fell. "I made a mistake," Alicia continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "And I know that saying sorry doesn't fix everything. But I want you to know that I recognize what I did. And I'll do better. I had to do better." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Hassan let her words sink in, turning them over in his mind. There was something raw about her tone, something that felt less rehearsed than he had expected. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I hope you mean it." Alicia nodded, her eyes glistening. "I do." She stood there for a moment longer, as though waiting for something, acceptance, maybe, or closure. When Hassan didn't say more, she nodded again and stepped away, retreating to the galley. The passengers began to stir, their focus shifting back to their own worlds. But for Hassan, the moment lingered. He turned to Mrs. Hargrove, who gave him a small, approving nod. "You got more patience than most," she said, her voice warm. "I hope she learns from this." Hassan shrugged. "I hope so too," he replied, but the truth was, he didn't know if she would. And even if she did, he wasn't sure it would change much, not for him, not for others like him. As the plane continued its journey, Hassan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He thought of his father, of Mrs. Hargrove, of the man who had spoken up, and even of Alicia. Each of them had played a part in this strange, uncomfortable moment of reckoning. Each of them had reminded him of the complexity of the world he inhabited, a world where progress and prejudice often collided in ways that left scars. Even when they didn't draw blood, the storm in the cabin had quieted, but the echoes of it remained. And for Hassan, those echoes were a reminder that the fight wasn't over, not here, not anywhere. The cabin's subdued hum seemed fragile, as if the slightest spark might ignite it again. Hassan sat still, his posture composed, but inside, the currents of exhaustion and resilience clashed like stormy waves. Every interaction, every sideways glance, every murmur felt like another layer to an unspoken narrative, one he knew too well. In the quiet, he wrestled not with rage but with the steady erosion of patience that comes from constantly having to prove, defend, and justify one's place in a world that too often demanded it. Meanwhile, Alicia stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Her apology had been sincere, at least she believed it had, but it felt hollow in the face of what she had set into motion. The murmurs of the passengers hadn't entirely subsided, and though she couldn't hear the words, she could feel their weight. Every glance cast her way carried judgment, every whisper a reminder of her failure. She thought of Hassan's calm response. His measured, "I hope you mean it." It had landed harder than any raised voice or accusation could have. His restraint had forced her to confront not just her actions but the quiet insidiousness of her assumptions. And though she had apologized, the air around her felt thick with unfinished business. At his seat, Hassan felt a new presence approach before he saw it. Turning slightly, he saw a middle-aged white man in a crisp button-down shirt standing in the aisle. Looking directly at him, the man hesitated for a moment, glancing around the cabin as if weighing whether to proceed. Finally, he leaned toward Hassan. "I just wanted to say," the man began, his voice low but firm, "you've handled all this with a lot of grace. More than most would have." Hassan nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but guarded. The man seemed to sense the complexity of the moment. "I don't know what it's like," he admitted, "but I can see it. And I just want you to know not everyone is blind to what's happening." Hassan forced a small smile. "I appreciate that," he said, and he did, though the words settled uneasily in his chest. This man's acknowledgement, while well-meaning, felt like a reflection of a broader truth, that witnessing injustice wasn't the same as bearing it. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, the cabin lights flickered briefly, and the hum of the engines grew louder. The movement startled some passengers, and for a moment, the focus shifted away from Hassan, Alicia, and the tension that bound them. But as the plane steadied, the attention drifted back. Mrs. Hargrove, ever vigilant, leaned toward Hassan once more. "You know," she said softly, her voice laced with a kind of maternal wisdom, "it's not just about what happens to us, it's about how we let it shape us." Hassan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "And what if it keeps happening?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "What if it never stops?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her seat's armrest. "Then you hold on to yourself," she said. "You hold on to who you are and don't let them take it from you." At the front of the plane, Idris Walker re-emerged, his presence instantly commanding attention. He moved down the aisle with deliberate steps. Stopping at Hassan's row, his gaze flicked briefly to the passengers around him, assessing, before settling on his son. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "I'm fine," Hassan replied, though his tone betrayed the fatigue beneath the words. Idris nodded, then turned to face the cabin, his tall frame radiating a quiet authority. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice cutting through the soft murmur of conversation. The passengers stilled, their attention snapping to him. Even Alicia peeked out from the galley, her expression a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "When I boarded this plane," Idris said, "I didn't expect to find myself in the middle of a lesson about how much work we still have to do. As people, as a society." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the cabin. "What happened here today isn't unique. It's part of a pattern, one that too many of us know all too well. And it's not just about my son, it's about everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Like their presence is a question that needs answering." Hassan looked down, his chest tightening. His father's words weren't just for the passengers, they were for him too. Idris's gaze shifted to Alicia, who had stepped tentatively into the aisle. "But what matters," he continued, "is not just recognizing when we're wrong. It's what we choose to do afterward. Do we let it define us? Or do we use it to grow? To do better? To be better?" Alicia nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll do better," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." Idris turned back to the passengers. "And for the rest of us," he said, "it's not enough to witness. We have to act. Speak up when you see something wrong. Challenge the systems and the habits that let it happen in the first place. That's how we change things, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The cabin was silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Then, slowly, One passenger began to clap. Another joined. And another. Until the cabin was filled with applause, not just for Idris, but for the truth he had spoken. The moment he had created. Hassan looked at his father. His heart swelling with pride. For all the exhaustion, all the frustration, this moment felt like a step forward. However small. As the applause died down, Idris placed a hand on Hassan's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Hassan nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm okay." Idris smiled, then returned to his seat, leaving Hassan with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in hours. The cabin had shifted, the tension easing into something quieter, more reflective, and though the journey wasn't over, Hassan felt a spark of hope, fragile but real, that things might one day be different. The applause had settled into a reflective hush, but the air in the cabin remained charged, alive with a weight that no one could fully articulate. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, filling the gaps between unspoken thoughts and unasked questions. Hassan sat back, his eyes on the closed book in his lap. The quiet around him wasn't peace, it was the residue of conflict. A kind of fragile stillness that carried the echoes of what had just transpired. He glanced at the passengers around him. Their faces betrayed a mix of emotions, some contemplative, others uncomfortable, a few visibly moved. Mrs. Hargrove, seated across the aisle, gave him a small, reassuring smile, but Hassan could sense the lingering tension even in her. It wasn't just about him or his father anymore. This was about everyone in that cabin, about what they had seen, what they had felt, and what they would carry with them when the plane landed. Alicia hovered near the galley, her hands clutching the edges of a serving tray she no longer needed. Her earlier apology, though sincere, felt inadequate in the face of what had unfolded. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues, the passengers, and most of all, Hassan and Idris. They weren't looking at her now, but their presence loomed large, pressing on her like a weight she couldn't escape. She thought of the moments earlier in the flight, the quick judgments, the subtle dismissals, the way she had assumed so much about Hassan before he had even spoken. Each memory felt like a sharp pinprick, her own actions now glaringly clear in hindsight. Her younger colleague approached her quietly. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know," Alicia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing this job for years. And I've never," she stopped herself, unsure how to finish the sentence. Never what? Never felt this exposed? Never been forced to confront her own biases so publicly? The younger attendant placed a hand on Alicia's arm. "What matters is what you do next," she said. "What you take from this." Alicia nodded, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure what next looked like. At his seat, Hassan shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the cabin settling into its uneasy rhythm, but his thoughts refused to quiet. The words his father had spoken, the applause that had followed it, all felt surreal, like a moment that existed outside of time. But the weight of it pressed on him, reminding him of the countless moments that had led to this one. He thought of the way Alicia had looked at him when he first boarded, the skepticism in her voice as she questioned his ticket. He thought of the passengers who had spoken up, the ones who had stayed silent, and the ones who had only joined the chorus after his father had intervened. And he thought of Mrs. Hargrove's words, "You hold on to who you are and don't let them take it from you." But what if the world didn't stop taking? What if every flight, every classroom, every boardroom carried the same quiet battle, the same unspoken tensions? How many times could he hold on before he began to break? The cabin was interrupted by a soft chime and the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The announcement brought a shift in energy. Passengers reaching for seatbelts, adjusting tray tables, and preparing for landing. But the undercurrent of tension remained. A quiet reminder that the journey wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And it wasn't over. As the plane descended, the view outside the window changed. The clouds thinned, revealing the city below, its streets and buildings laid out like a patchwork quilt. Hassan stared at the view, his reflection faintly visible in the window. He didn't feel relief that the flight was ending. Instead, he felt the weight of what came next. When the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the tension in the cabin shifted once more. Passengers began to gather their belongings, the hum of conversation growing louder. Alicia moved through the aisle, assisting where needed, her demeanor careful, almost timid. She stopped briefly at Hassan's row, her hands clasped in front of her. "Hassan," she said softly, "thank you for your patience." Hassan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I hope you'll remember this," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. Alicia nodded, her eyes glistening. "I will," she said, and this time, she meant it. As the passengers disembarked, Idris waited for Hassan, standing tall near the exit. When Hassan reached him, his father placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch both grounding and comforting. "You did well," Idris said, his voice low. "I didn't do anything," Hassan replied, his tone edged with frustration. Idris stopped, turning to face his son fully. "You stayed true to yourself," he said. "Sometimes, that's the hardest thing to do." Hassan nodded, though his father's words felt like a lesson he wasn't ready to fully grasp. Together, they walked toward the terminal, their steps steady, their presence commanding attention even as they sought none. Behind them, Alicia watched from the doorway of the plane. She saw the way passengers glanced at Idris and Hassan, some with admiration, others with guilt or discomfort. She saw Mrs. Hargrove nod approvingly as she passed, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. And she saw her own reflection in the window, a reminder of the person she had been at the start of the flight and the person she wanted to become. As she turned back to prepare for the next leg of her journey, Alicia made a quiet promise to herself, to see people as they were, not as her assumptions painted them, to be better. The terminal was alive with movement and noise, but Hassan and Idris walked in silence. They didn't need words to acknowledge what they had endured, what they had overcome. For Hassan, the journey wasn't just about the miles traveled, it was about the quiet fire within him, the resilience that burned brighter with every challenge. And as he stepped into the bustling crowd, he carried that fire with him, knowing it would light the way forward. The terminal was alive with the chaotic rhythm of arrivals. Luggage wheels clattered against polished floors, voices echoed from departure boards, and the faint hiss of overhead announcements weaved through the noise. Yet, for Hassan, the bustling scene was muffled, as if the world had wrapped itself in a haze. He walked beside his father, Idris, their steps in sync, their silence heavy with the weight of the flight they had just endured. He felt the burn of every glance cast their way as they moved through the terminal. Some were fleeting, others lingering, a mix of curiosity and unease that he had come to recognize. It was the gaze of strangers trying to place them. Why is he walking so confidently? Who is he? Should I be paying attention? Hassan had grown used to these questions hanging unspoken in the air. But today, after hours of tension on the plane, they felt sharper, heavier. Idris, ever composed, guided them toward the exit. His presence was steady, his shoulders square, his expression calm. It was a bearing Hassan had always admired, a kind of unshakable strength that seemed impervious to the world's provocations. But Hassan knew better. He had seen the moments when his father's shoulders sagged, when the exhaustion seeped through the cracks in his armor. Idris's strength wasn't unyielding, it was chosen, renewed daily through the quiet battles he fought. "Dad," Hassan said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Idris turned his head slightly, his expression softening. "Yes, son? Do you ever get tired of this?" Hassan asked, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Of always having to hold it together? Of always having to prove something?" Idris stopped walking, placing a hand on Hassan's shoulder. His eyes, sharp and discerning, met his son's. "Every day," he said simply. "But the question isn't whether you get tired. It's what you do with that tiredness." Hassan looked down, his father's words settling in his chest like a weight. He wanted to understand, to embrace that resilience, but in that moment, all he felt was the ache of carrying too much. As they approached the exit, the glass doors slid open to reveal the city beyond, a sprawling, pulsating landscape of lives intersecting and diverging. The cool air hit Hassan's face, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the flight. But before they could step into the open, a voice called out behind them. "Excuse me." They turned to see Alicia, still in her uniform, hurrying toward them. Her breath came in short bursts, her face flushed with urgency. For a moment, neither Hassan nor Idris spoke, their expressions unreadable as she approached. Alicia began, then hesitated, her gaze flickering between father and son. She clasped her hands in front of her, as if steadying herself. "I needed to say this in person." I know I already apologized. But I want you to know I meant it. And not just because of who you are, she added, her eyes locking with Hassan's. But because it was wrong. All of it. Hassan blinked, caught off guard by the rawness in her voice. Idris, standing tall beside him, nodded slightly, as if urging her to continue. I've been doing this job for years, Alicia said, her words rushing out now. And I never stop to think about the assumptions I make. About how those assumptions affect people. But today, I saw it, I felt it, and I'm sorry, truly. The terminal noise seemed to fade as her words hung in the air. Passers-by glanced curiously at the small group, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding its context. Hassan took a deep breath. His emotions tangled. He wanted to accept her apology, to believe in its sincerity. But he also felt the sting of 1,000 moments like this. Moments that wouldn't be undone by a single act of contrition. I appreciate that, he said finally, his voice measured. I really do. But it's not about me forgiving you. It's about what you do next. Alicia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I'll do better, she said, her voice breaking. I promise. Idris, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His voice, calm and firm, carried a weight that seemed to anchor the moment. Growth isn't comfortable, he said, but it's necessary. What matters is that you don't let this lesson fade. Alicia nodded again, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Both of you. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Hassan watched her go, a mixture of emotions swirling within him: relief, frustration, hope, and exhaustion. He turned to his father, who was already looking at him with a knowing expression. You did well, Idris said, his hand resting on Hassan's shoulder. Did I? Hassan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Idris smiled faintly. Sometimes, doing well isn't about what you say or do. It's about what you endure. And you endured with grace. As they stepped outside, the city greeted them with its usual chaos: honking horns, bustling crowds, the faint hum of distant construction. But for Hassan, the world felt different, heavier somehow. The flight had ended, but the journey was far from over. He looked at his father, who stood tall against the backdrop of the city, and felt a flicker of hope amidst the exhaustion. Perhaps, he thought, the weight wasn't his alone to carry. Perhaps, together, they could hold it. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world could learn to lighten the load. The city loomed around Hassan and Idris as they stepped into the sprawling chaos of the terminal's exterior. Taxi horns blared, conversations blended into a cacophony, and the scent of exhaust mingled with the faint promise of rain in the air. For most people, it was just another afternoon. But for Hassan, the world outside the airport felt charged, as though every sound and sight carried a meaning he couldn't quite grasp. He glanced at his father, who moved through the crowd with the quiet dignity that seemed to shield him from its chaos. Idris's steps were measured, deliberate, as though even walking to the curb was an act of resistance, a refusal to be rushed, diminished, or overlooked. Hassan tried to emulate that ease, but the tension of the day clung to him like a second skin. As they waited for their car, Hassan's thoughts churned. The events of the flight replayed in his mind, each moment sharp and vivid. Alicia's clipped tone, Mrs. Hargrove's fiery defense, his father's commanding presence. He thought of the passengers who had whispered, who had looked at him not as a person but as a question they were trying to answer. He thought of Alicia's apology, sincere but fraught with the weight of years of ignorance. Dad, Hassan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Idris turned to him, his expression calm but attentive. Do you think she'll change? Idris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he said, change is a process, not a moment. What matters is whether she's willing to face herself honestly. Hassan frowned. And if she's not? Idris met his son's eyes, his gaze steady. Then the lesson was wasted on her. But not on you. Their car arrived, and as they climbed in, Hassan's mind lingered on his father's words. The idea that the burden of growth often fell on those who had been wronged rather than those who had caused the harm felt both profound and deeply unfair. But it wasn't new. Hassan had spent his life navigating these unspoken rules, learning to carry a weight that others barely acknowledged. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced at them through the rearview mirror. Where to? He asked. Idris gave the address, his voice calm and assured. The driver nodded, pulling into traffic, but Hassan noticed the way his eyes lingered a moment too long in the mirror. As if trying to place them, to make sense of who they were. Hassan stared out the window. The city blurring into a patchwork of glass and steel. He thought of how often he had been reduced to a curiosity. A question, or an assumption. Even now, sitting in the backseat of a car, he felt the weight of being seen but not known. As they drove, Idris broke the silence. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "there was a time when I let moments like today consume me." Hassan turned to his father. Surprised. "You? But you're always so controlled?" Idris finished, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That took years, son. Years of anger, frustration, and questioning whether I was doing enough or too much. Whether it was worth it." Hassan hesitated. "And now?" "Now," Idris said, "I understand that the fight isn't just about what happens to us. It's about how we respond, how we carry ourselves. It's about making sure that when the world looks at us, they see our humanity, no matter how hard they try not to." Hassan let the words sink in, their weight settling over him like a blanket. He thought of the passengers on the flight, of the way they had watched him, judged him, defended him. He thought of Alicia, her apology trembling on the edge of her voice, and wondered if she had seen his humanity in the end. When they arrived at their destination, a quiet brownstone nestled in a tree-lined street, Hassan stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The air was cooler here, less charge, but the tension in his chest remained. Idris joined him on the sidewalk, his hand resting briefly on Hassan's shoulder. "Come inside," he said. "We'll talk more." But Hassan lingered, his gaze drifting to the street. He thought of the ripple effect his father often spoke of, the way one moment could spark a series of changes. Some seen, most unseen. He wondered what kind of ripples today's events might create. Would Alicia carry the lesson forward? Would the passengers who had spoken up remember their courage? Or would they retreat into silence the next time they saw injustice? And what about him? What ripples would he create? As the evening light faded, Hassan followed his father inside, the question still heavy in his mind. The world beyond the brownstone's doors was vast and unrelenting. But within its walls, there was space to think, to breathe, to prepare. And Hassan knew that when he stepped back out, the weight of the world would still be there. But so would he. The brownstone was quiet, save for the occasional creak of its wooden floors. Hassan sat at the dining table, a glass of water untouched in front of him. The soft glow of the overhead light cast long shadows, reflecting the stillness of the room. Idris sat across from him, his hands folded neatly, his eyes steady as he watched his son wrestle with the day's events. Hassan spoke first, breaking the silence. "Do you ever feel like no matter what we do, it's never enough? That no matter how we carry ourselves, how patient we are, it doesn't change the way people see us?" Idris leaned back, his gaze turning contemplative. "I feel that way often," he admitted. "There are days when the weight of it all feels insurmountable. But, Hassan, we don't carry ourselves the way we do to change their perceptions. We do it to protect who we are." Hassan frowned, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. But what if protecting who we are means never showing how angry we are? How tired we are? Isn't that just another way of letting them win? Idris let the question linger, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered his response. "Anger has its place," he said finally. "But it's a tool, not a home. If we live in it, it consumes us. If we wield it wisely, it can shape the world." Hassan looked down at his hands, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. He thought of Alicia's trembling apology, the passengers' whispers, his father's steady presence. The day had felt like a battle, one fought not with fists or shouts but with silence, dignity, and the quiet assertion of his humanity. But it had left him drained, a weariness that felt deeper than physical exhaustion. "I'm tired, Dad," he said softly. "I'm tired of always being the lesson." Idris reached across the table, his hand resting gently on Hassan's. "I know, son," he said, his voice low and warm. "But every lesson plants a seed. Some people will let it wither, but others will let it grow. And that growth? That's what makes the fight worth it." Later that night, Hassan sat by the window in his room, staring out at the city. The lights stretched endlessly, each one a reminder of the millions of lives unfolding simultaneously, each with their own struggles, joys, and questions, but in the vastness of it all, he felt a deep isolation, as though his place in the world was both undeniable and precarious. He thought about the flight, the storm that had brewed in that confined space, and the way it had mirrored the larger struggles of his life. The moments of tension, the fleeting acts of solidarity, the quiet reckonings, they were all fragments of a larger narrative, one that was both personal and universal. And yet, amidst the heaviness, there was something else, a spark, faint but persistent. It was the same spark he had seen in his father's eyes, in Mrs. Hargrove's defiance, even in Alicia's halting apology. It was the belief that change was possible, even if it was slow, even if it was imperfect. The next morning, Hassan stood at the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Idris entered the room, his movements unhurried, his expression calm. "Busy day ahead?" Idris asked, his tone casual but knowing. Hassan nodded. "Always." Idris smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried years of understanding. "Remember," he said, "the weight of the sky isn't yours to carry alone. But the way you hold your piece of it? That matters." Hassan met his father's gaze, the words settling into him like stones dropped into still water. He didn't have an answer. Not yet, but he felt a quiet resolve taking root, a determination to keep moving forward, to hold his piece of the sky with strength and grace. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the city stretched out before him, vast and unrelenting, but Hassan walked into it with steady steps, his head held high. The weight was still there, but so was he, and for now, that was enough.